It is time for a thorough breakdown of episode 1 or chapter 1 of the Book of Boba Fett with the title Stranger in a Strange Land. I'm Father Roderick. I'm a priest, obviously, but also a huge Star Wars fan. And what I love to do is to dive into these episodes, dive into the movies, and find the nuggets, the hidden treasure that is under the surface of the overall story. And that is absolutely the case with this first episode. There is so much subtext. There are so many underlying themes that are very fundamental to the world of Star Wars and also important, I would say, in general. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these important themes and show you what lies beneath the surface. Clickbait, it may surprise you. Just kidding. So let's start with the title, Stranger in a Strange Land. Now that sounds like a very good overall title, but immediately for me it was a signal that this was going to be a special story because Stranger in a Strange Land actually comes from a biblical passage. This title of this first episode of the Book of Boba Fett refers to the book of Exodus. I mean, it's not by accident that the entire series is called Book of Boba Fett. That almost in itself sounds biblical. You've got in the Bible, you've got the book of Revelations, the book of Job, the book of this and the book of that. Because the Bible, of course, is not just one book. It's a collection of a lot of different books from different cultures. And here, the Book of Boba Fett is just one tome, you could say, one collection of stories from one era in Star Wars. And maybe there will be many other books in the future about different periods and different people in this overall history of the galaxy of Star Wars. So anyway, this Stranger in a Strange Land refers to Moses. And in Exodus, the second chapter, verse 22, this is exactly what is mentioned. Moses has received a son, he already had a daughter, and then he has to come up with a name for his son. And he calls his son Gershom. And then it says that was to remind himself that he too once was a stranger in a strange land. Now, for those of you that may have to scratch your heads a little bit. What was the story of Moses again? Let me refresh your memory. Moses was this child that was born from slaves, basically. The people of God was deported by the Egyptians to work for the Pharaoh. They were no longer in their own country. They were not free. And there were lots and lots of restrictions on living their own culture. But of course, they kept believing that God would one day save them. And so Moses, when he is born, is given a new future by his mother because she places him in a little basket, puts it on the river, and then a little bit further down the river, the basket is found by the daughter of the Pharaoh. She finds this child, knows nothing about the child, but raises him at the court of the Pharaoh. So it's an incredible story in itself that a child born from slaves and actually destined to become a slave is adopted by basically the captors, by the bad guys, and is raised as one of them. And yet Moses, over time, discovers that he's actually not one of them. He is no Egyptian, even though he was raised in the tradition of the Egyptians and everything. But when he gets older, he discovers that actually he is a stranger in a strange land. This is not his homeland. Egypt is his adoptive land, but he is a Jew, like all the other slaves. And that is when he realizes that he has a role to play. He needs to free the people from slavery and bring them to the promised land. Now, this may ring a bell. Isn't this exactly what George Lucas used for the prequels, for the story of Anakin, who is born as a slave, lives in Mos Espa, the city that we get to see again. I was so excited about that. And there is a long tradition of slavery in Mos Espa, of course, run by the Hutts mostly. They became rich because of slave trading mostly, and some other illegal practices. So this is not new to the Star Wars canon. This whole theme of slavery and these references to Moses as the former slave who now becomes the redeemer, that is exactly what Anakin was called to do. He was supposed to free the slaves, but we know how that ends. He fails. He cannot even save his mother when she is taken captive by the Tusken Raiders. And so instead of saving, he just kills and destroys. This story shows that there is another way. And it's a much better way than the path that Anakin chose to follow. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the story of Exodus. So Moses discovers, I am a stranger in a strange land. But he's not the only one who discovers that. Pharaoh also discovers it. And then he is cast out. No matter what his upbringing was, he is now the enemy, and he is now in the desert, and will have to, well, you know what happens, he feels called by God that now is the time to lead his people into the desert for this 40-year journey to a better future, to what the Bible story calls the promised land. Which immediately makes me wonder, there's so many parallels here with the story of Boba Fett, which I will explain in a minute. Is this what's going to be the story arc of the Book of Boba Fett? Is this going to be this criminal who enslaved others as a bounty hunter, then becomes a slave himself in this first episode, or this first chapter, and then discovers that he's actually called to be a redeemer in a certain way, to be, yes, a bad guy, maybe, a crime lord, but ruling with justice and equity instead of with fear and violence like Jabba and the Empire. I love the premise of this. So let's look at Boba Fett mirroring this story of Moses. He, too, was at first well respected at the court of let's say, the Pharaoh of Tatooine, Jabba the Hutt. We see him in the caverns of Jabba's palace. He's well respected, and of course, he brought Jabba his prize, the body of Han Solo in carbonite. So of course, everybody likes this guy. This is someone who works for our boss, so we'd better be careful and kind to him. Otherwise, we too might end up in carbonite, or worse. So at the same time, he in this episode, we see him cast out. The palace is empty. Jabba the Hutt is no longer there to save him. In fact, everybody had forgotten about him when he was down in the Sarlacc pit. And now he's trying to survive in this strange world, Tatooine. He's not from Tatooine. Surrounded by sand people. This is the total opposite of the world that he comes from. He was, as a clone, he grew up surrounded by water and the sea, and now he's on this desert planet. So it's literally a stranger from an opposite place, now in this desert world where everything is dry and there's no water. And again, it's I love it how they play with these contrasts in this episode. And he's now surrounded by strangers, not just all the bad guys that are out to get him, but also surrounded by sand people and Jawas and very strange monsters. So we also see that he becomes part of all the other peoples on Tatooine that are exploited or marginalized by the people in power. And this was already going on when the Hutts arrived in Mos Espa. They grew we all know Mos Eisley as an important city, but actually Mos Espa was much more powerful and much more wealthy thanks to the slave trading, mostly by the Hutts. So there's something very two-sided in the backstory of Tatooine. Yes, there are cities like Mos Espa that have been very exuberant and rich in the past, but it was on the backs of all these exploited people, all these slaves. And so we see some examples of the things that are still going on. You have that attack on that moisture farm by some bad guys that I think we've seen previously, maybe in the prequels, or I don't know, I don't remember exactly at what point, but they're definitely not new. But I think they actually were also briefly seen in The Mandalorian. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what matters most is that we still have remnants of the oppression and the slavery that was so normal under the Hutts. And even though Jabba is dead, not all criminals are gone, and people are still oppressed on Tatooine. And now Boba Fett gets to experience the destiny of those living in captivity and who are exploited and maltreated. So what I loved is that we go back to Mos Espa, because that's where, for us as Star Wars fans, the story of slavery, our awareness of slavery in the world of Star Wars began. With, of course, Shmi and her son, Anakin Skywalker, both are introduced to us as slaves. They are unfree. And it's thanks to the visit by Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi that ultimately they're able to buy basically the freedom for Anakin, and they're not even able to free Shmi. And Anakin vows to come back and to liberate her too. He's got this dream about him leading an exodus, literally an exodus, from slavery to freedom, and he fails. He's not the Moses of Star Wars. On the contrary, it turns into, the evil one in the Star Wars, at least temporarily. This story shows someone who may actually take over the job and bring true freedom to those that are oppressed. But how, we're still going to discover that later. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if this entire book of Boba Fett is going to be about Boba Fett becoming a redeemer, or the archetype of a savior in a certain way, savior especially for the poor. And maybe he'll continue to steal from the rich, or if Boba Fett becomes a good guy, then it's no longer Boba Fett. So, but we'll see how I'm pretty sure that they will find the right balance here. So other signs that this story of a stranger in a strange land was inspired by the story of Moses. At one point, there is a visual reference, a very clear visual reference, where Boba puts on his costume, his harness, his helmet. He's helped by these little droids that have the heads of the surface droids, but they're more advanced and definitely cleaner than most of the surface droids that we saw in the prequels and in The Mandalorian. But this whole sequence where he puts on his armor mirrors a very similar scene in the Ten Commandments, that classic movie about Moses, where it's the Pharaoh who dons his armor and his, jewelry and everything, and their servants helping him to dress up. And visually, it's almost identical. So this is so obvious that the writers, the creators of this episode want us to know this is about, this story mirrors the story of Moses, and gives you a key to understand what's truly going on. This is why also some Star Wars fans were a bit disheartened by this episode. It was like, what's going on? This is so atypical for Boba Fett. This is not the story that we wanted or expected. There's a lot of negativity. And I think, sure, it may not be what everyone expected this series to be, but for me, it's like, well, that invites me to dig deeper. So why would they tell the story this way? There may be a reason for that, and I think that the biblical subtext of this episode may give us a key as to why they tell the story as they do, the way they do. Another visual, this is a more subtle reference to Egypt, is that in Mos Espa's architecture and in the background, you see a lot of elements that are kind of a bit like in Egypt. You see these hieroglyph types, signs on the walls. You've got the kind of buildings. You got the tents outside, very much a reminder of the nomad life that we also see in these early biblical stories. There's a lot of visual language that is very much inspired by these early biblical stories. Of course, Moses is Old Testament, and there is another character in the Bible who mirrors a lot of the story of Moses, and well, it's the main character of the sequel, the New Testament, it is Jesus. And Jesus is called the new Moses. He is another Moses. Actually, some people in the biblical stories themselves are described as saying, well, maybe this is just Moses who returned. And if you remember this transfiguration on the mountain, Jesus is shown with Moses at his side, conversing with Moses. So that's just all biblical language to tell you Jesus is just like Moses. Just look carefully. You know the story about Moses. Just look at the version of Jesus, and you'll be surprised what you will discover. Similarities and dissimilarities. Now, this is also true in the Book of Boba Fett, in Stranger in a Strange Land. We also see a lot of visual references to the figure of Jesus, this new Moses. Also someone who is freeing people from slavery, not literal slavery, but from the slavery of sin and everything that holds you back, kind of the slaves of the dark side. Jesus is there to forgive, to give people a new future, to lead them to the promised land, not a real country, but a land beyond the horizon of our existence. And so in this episode, we see, of course, and thankfully, the very famous scene of the escape from the Sarlacc pit. This was depicted already in the comics, but now we see it for real, and I think they did a great job. But of course, this whole escape from the Sarlacc pit is also a metaphor. It's not just a very cool sequence with the zombie stormtrooper that has been in there probably for many years, and he uses the tube, the breathing tube from the stormtrooper, because apparently he's still carrying some reserves with oxygen, and that is how he's able to breathe. But maybe more importantly, if it's oxygen, he can set it on fire, which is what happens. But he gets scarred in the process. Now, this entire sequence is also a metaphor of death and resurrection. It's called a pit. So it's a hole in the ground. It's a grave. You know, C-3PO tells the victims of his mighty Sarlacc that they are going to be in there for eternity. You know, for thousands of years they will be consumed and decomposed and whatnot. So it was eternal damnation. It's literally hell couldn't be worse than this. And so in the figure of Jesus, you have someone who also descended into death. It's called like that oftentimes. You know, he descends into hell. It's in the creed that Christians profess. So Jesus descends into hell and then raises from the dead. And that is, I think, the subtext of this Sarlacc pit sequence. It is Boba Fett dying, but it's not just physically dying, but his entire past, his life as a merciless bounty hunter dies there and then. And what rises is a new person, which is immediately then symbolized by Boba Fett being stripped from his armor by the Jawas, leading into, of course, the scenes in The Mandalorian in the second season. But what's much more important is what is the Boba Fett visually that is left behind in the sand, who has nothing more that is interesting for the Jawas. The Jawas are just, you know, what is worth something to us? What can we sell? But the person itself is not important to them, has no value. So what's left over of Boba once he is robbed of his clothes, of his armor, his helmet? You know, it's all like super valuable. Well, we see him lying there in a white jumpsuit. The color white is not by accident. Now, of course, we've seen in the Clone Wars, some of these clones, when they're off duty, they also wear these same white jumpers. But here, it gets a very symbolic meaning as well, because white is also the color of the robes that the baptismal candidates would receive after they've been baptized. Now, baptism, you may associate that with life and water, you know. But what we often forget is that baptism is also a symbol of death, of dying. When you go into the water, you step into what for many people meant death. Water, you could drown in water. And so the whole ritual of being immersed and going underwater literally is also a reference to dying. It was scary to be pushed underwater. But then you're pulled up out of that water. It's a new beginning. It's a new life. And so this double symbolism of baptism, both meaning death and renewal, rebirth, resurrection, is very strong in the Catholic liturgy of baptism, and it's also present here in this episode. Boba Fett, the Boba Fett we knew, is dead. And the Boba Fett that rises from the grave is a new person who has a new future and, may I say, a new vocation. And I think this series is going to be about that. It's the story of the new Boba Fett, and everything is possible. Now, this whole sequence where Boba Fett is robbed from his clothes or his armor also reminded me of something we see with Jesus during his passion. They rob him, the soldiers take away his clothes, and they sell the clothes. So they even play a dice game to see who can win this cloth, because they don't want to rip it into parts. It's too valuable for that. So in a way, the Jawas here mirror the soldiers in the story of the Passion of the Christ. And he, in his white robes, he is literally like the newly baptized. The color white means it's a blank slate. Everything that follows can be written on it. There is nothing that remains from who he was. And that's very powerful in this first episode visually. I think the director did a terrific job. So he is then dragged by the Sand People. And of course, you may have recognized the visual imagery that nods towards the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's a classic Western scene here. There are lots of details that are so well done. You know, the Tusken Raiders always going single file to hide their numbers, and it's amazing. Plus, it just looks so fantastic. Now, the next sequence that Boba Fett remembers when he's in the Bacta tank, because a lot of these flashbacks happen while he is being healed. Now, something about the Bacta tank. We know that this is something that we've seen before in Empire Strikes Back first, but then later on also in The Mandalorian. Bacta is a fluid that will heal you, that will renew your skin, literally. It takes away the scars, and you get new skin, and sometimes it will regrow parts of your body. So it's a very powerful fluid. But of course, there's subtext here too. Because what is the symbol, the material symbol that we use for baptism? It's water. And the water is meant to renew you, to heal what was broken, and to give you a new life, and in a certain way, a new existence. So when we see that Boba Fett lies in this Bacta tank, it's another symbol that refers to baptism and renewal. He's healed of the scars of his actions, his previous actions. But what we also see in these flashbacks, he's healed mentally. He starts to understand who he is and who he is called to be. And I would even say he's also healed morally. He's done a lot of things that are morally evil. He worked for Darth Vader and for the Emperor. He was a collaborator. He was a traitor in a certain way. Definitely acting out of revenge to avenge his father, Jango, killed by the Jedi. But there was so much in his life that objectively was wrong. And all these sequences in the Bacta tank are there for a reason. They're showing us bit by bit the old Boba Fett ceases to exist, partially involuntary, but then there's also healing taking place. And he becomes, in this water, the Bacta tank that, kind of mirrors the baptismal font, he becomes a new person with new strength also, ready for the task at hand. We see in these flashbacks that he's being tortured by the Sand People. He's humiliated. The torture scene mirrors a lot of the Jesus movies. Think of The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, where we see Jesus being, flagellation, and it's very gruesome. Here, this is also pretty violent, even though at first it's just the kids that are torturing him, but he's tied to a pole, just like in a lot of the iconography of Christ. When he's tortured, he's also tied to a pole, and he can't defend himself. He's helpless. He's humiliated. They make fun of him. They don't take him serious anymore, just like the Roman soldiers were making fun of Jesus. If you're the Messiah, then come down from this cross and save yourself. And then, everybody's laughing. And then there's this scene where he's begging for water. He's brought into the desert to dig up these water pods, he's led by a kid. How humiliating is that for someone who's been enslaving Wookiees and Jedi and whatnot? Now he's being led by a kid into the desert, and he has to beg for mercy, beg for water. Now this begging for water, another straight reference to Jesus on the cross, who at one point says, "I'm thirsty." And then someone gives him sour wine, vinegar, basically on a stick. Also, maybe a reference or maybe a coincidence, but I can see some rhyme here and reason. Boba Fett is surrounded basically by two people you cannot trust, two criminals. It's, on the one hand, the Rhodian snitch, the Red Greedo, shorthand, and the Tusken Kid, who also has beaten him, and it's been really, really violent towards Boba Fett. So you've got two criminals surrounding the good guy, and one of the criminals refuses to convert. Just like the two criminals on either side of Jesus on the cross, there's one who still mocks Jesus on the cross, and the other one, the good criminal, converts, and he says, "We can't do this, This man needs help, and he didn't do anything wrong. We are here because of our actions, because of our crimes, but he is innocent." And then Jesus tells him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Here, is it coincidence? Is it on purpose? You've got these Boba Fett surrounded by two criminals. One stays evil. The Rhodian does not want to join Boba Fett in his actually betrays him again, while he's himself is also a victim of the Tusken Raiders, and yet he still betrays Boba Fett when he tries to escape. But the other criminal, the Tusken Raider kid, he is going to ultimately change his attitude. He will turn good in a certain way, but only after something important happens that I now have to address. What, of course, is the core of the similarity between this first story about Boba Fett and him being tortured by the Tusken Raiders and the story of Jesus is that he ultimately seems to be willing to sacrifice his life to save his executioners. What happens? There is this monster that lurks beneath the surface. At first I was like, are we going to see another Krayt dragon? But this monster is a lot smaller, but not less dangerous, because just like one of these monsters from the Mortal Kombat video games, he has two pairs of hands. And you know what? From an evolutionary standpoint, that's actually not a bad idea, because the way this monster hunts is by hiding underneath the sand like a lizard or a snake. And then he is hunting for creatures, animals, or humans in this case, looking for these water pods. He probably knows where these water pods are. So since these are just small pods and they're everywhere, it's very helpful to have four hands. You can put a hand near four pods, and then your chances that you'll actually catch something is much bigger. So I love that idea. Also, by the way, the shape of this creature may be a reference to another Disney property, intellectual property, namely John Carter on Mars. Remember the Martians? They also have the same physiognomy. They also have two sets of arms. And then the style of the fight reminded me very much of the Ray Harryhausen monsters. Actually, I was convinced when I was doing my viewing party my watch party online that this creature came straight from one of the Harryhausen movies, but I looked, I couldn't find it. So even though there are similar creatures, the 4 arms, that is not a Harryhausen thing, but it could have been. So anyway, once the monster attacks, and there is imminent danger for all 3 of the people there, Boba Fett fights and he saves the boy. He saves the Tusken Raider. And that is a very important moment. He does it by risking his own life. So he is putting his own life in jeopardy to save the one that was almost killing him by his brutal torture just before. That shows moral character. That shows you that something has changed in Boba Fett. He's not just saving his own skin, working for money. He is doing the right thing. And that's going to pay off pretty well later on in the story. Because then they go back to the Tusken Raider camp, and even though the child brags carrying the head of the monster and probably tells stories that he was the one who defeated the monster, one of the older Tusken Raiders looks at Boba Fett and nods and says, "I know what you did," and offers him some water. So that's, of course, like, smoking a pipe together. It's peace now. A gesture, giving someone water, that's a very powerful gesture of mercy and reconciliation. Jesus at one point says, if you give these little ones even a drop of water, that you do it for me. So the same gesture of giving water to Jesus is also reflected here in this very simple, powerful moment. Then the theme of tributes is introduced. We see that Boba Fett, once he is finally on his throne, all sorts of representatives come to pay him tribute. There's this scene where I don't know if you noticed that, but one of these creatures offers him the skin of a Wookiee. That's pretty gruesome. And Boba Fett, when he was still an active bounty hunter, he would carry around these pieces of Wookiee hair. Maybe not scalps, but still, yeah, he must have hunted Wookiees in the past. But this whole idea of offering tributes to the king, that is very old. We see this also in mythology and in old stories in Egypt, and also, remember, a very recent story. We had the first episode around the time of the end of Christmas time, and then we always read the story of the Magi, the visit of the Magi. What happens in that story is that these 3 kings, these very wise and powerful people from the East, they come to this child and offer him their tributes, their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Very, very expensive things. But they offer that to the child because they recognize that this is not just a baby. This is, in fact, a king. It's hidden for everyone, but the wise man, the Magi, recognize in this child the future king. And so we see, again, another parallel here. All these representatives come to pay tribute to the new king, this unlikely hero, Boba Fett, risen from the dead and now sitting on the throne of what once was the oppressor, Jabba the Hutt, feared by everyone. It's the same throne, but it's a different type of ruler. It's a different type of king who is going to take over, or maybe a different type of pharaoh. This one knows what mercy is, which is immediately demonstrated by the sequence with the Gamorreans. You have that droid, and at first I was like, I know this droid. Who is actually saying, well, we're just going to torture these Gamorreans. They're not to be trusted. And I thought it was actually a droid from the innards of the sandcrawler that we see that first picks up R2-D2 and C-3PO and in A New Hope. But actually, I recognized the robot from the torture scene in The Return of the Jedi, where he is also in Jabba's palace and he's torturing our lovely Gonk droid, who gets tortured for whatever reason, maybe because he refused to serve drinks or something like that, or he spilled drinks because he's so clumsy. And well, that's what Gunk. He's not meant to be a serving droid. But anyway, so he proposes to torture the Gamorrean guards, and then Boba, despite everyone else telling him that they've got a bad feeling about this, Boba Fett is saying, you know what? I'm going to give them another chance. It would be the same behavior that we see with Jesus. He's always forgiving people, giving them another chance. And sometimes people that no one else wanted to be seen with. Think of Matthew, who was a tax collector for the Romans, and Jesus tells him, you know what, tonight I want to dine at your place. And everybody is outraged. It's like, this guy is not to be trusted. He works for the enemy. And Jesus is, at that time says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That is very similar to what Boba Fett says here. I am not out here for vengeance, for torture. No. My authority comes from respect. It's very powerful, very moral. And then you have this scene where he gets a helmet full of coins, or he gets a lot of money and he puts it in a helmet. I was wondering if that was a reference to the money that Judas received when he betrayed Jesus, the silver coins. So this may be a warning. We see at one point the helmet falls on the ground and all the coins are scattered on the floor. It may be referring to the moment that his father, Jango Fett, got beheaded. Is that also going to be Boba Fett's future? Is he also going to be beheaded? Well, if he continues to work for money, and that may not end well. So maybe this is one of those moments, symbolic moments, that do you want to be Judas or do you want to be Jesus? The sand monster that I mentioned before is, in story-wise, what we call a threshold guardian. Since George Lucas and Star Wars in general tends to follow the story-wise the path of the hero or the hero's journey. At one point, there's always the one guardian that prevents you from pursuing your journey towards your future, your vocation, and that guardian needs to be defeated. A very clear, similar moment happens in The Phantom Menace, right before Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi are ready to take Anakin with them. Who pops up? Darth Maul for the first time. And Darth Maul is trying to prevent them from leaving the planet. We don't know at that time why, but, he's like a devil, Satan-like figure that appears, almost kills Anakin by running over him, and then continues to fight Boba Fett, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And so it's clear that here the sand monster is that guardian that almost prevents the story of the Book of Boba Fett to continue, and he needs to be defeated. Which, of course, happens, and Boba Fett kills it with a chain. I've also commented on that during my watch party. This obviously is done on purpose to make you think back of the way Leia killed Jabba the Hutt, the previous occupant of the throne in Jabba's palace. She, too, used a similar chain to choke Jabba to death. Here, Boba Fett does the same thing with the sand monster because, of course, hey, Leia did the same to prepare the throne for Boba Fett. And so this is what George Lucas calls poetry. This is thematic poetry where you create not like exact copies of what you've done before, but similarities that are so striking that it makes you think, I've seen this before. Oh my gosh, that was exactly what happened there and there in a totally different environment, different people. And it makes you understand that these themes are important because they come back, they return. This poetry, this Star Wars poetry, is not to just be fancy, but repetition and structural similarities. Also, when you do biblical studies, we're very much trained in recognizing these similarities. Sometimes even within one paragraph, you can have words that are repeated. They are always markers that now we're going to hear something important. And in this case, the death of the sand monster, the death of the guardian. It's also the symbol of everything that kept Boba Fett himself chained to his past. It's time to choke it, to kill it, to be done with the chains, and to be free. So the chains are also, Leia, too, was working as a slave for Jabba. And she uses her own chains to kill her oppressor, the one who kept her as a slave. And now it's Boba Fett using the same chains that kept him tied to the other prisoners, so also the symbol of his slavery, to kill the monster and to free himself to start his new future, his new vocation. So you see how deep this goes and how well constructed this episode is? I was blown away once I started to realize what they were actually doing with this first story. And I hope it helps you to rediscover the genius of this first chapter in the Book of Boba Fett. Again, it may not be everything you expected, but that's what makes it so cool. It's like many other moments. The Mandalorian was nothing that we expected. It was so much better than we expected. And also The Mandalorian had all these different layers. The Last Jedi, lots of Star Wars fans still hate that movie because it did something totally opposite of what they expected. It was all about expectations and then missing the mark. That's the main theme of The Last Jedi is like life is often not what you expect. People are not what you expect them to be. Even Luke Skywalker is not the Luke Skywalker that we wanted to be, or even Mark Hamill didn't expect his character to go to go in that direction. But that's meant to make you think. It makes you, well, what does the director truly wants to say here? What is the story arc? And the more it surprises me, the more I like it. Because there is something to explain here. There's something that helps me dig deeper until I understand what's truly going on. Hopefully this video helped you as well. Final thought. The director of this episode is none other than Robert Rodriguez. And oh my goodness, if you've never seen anything else from Robert Rodriguez, go watch one of his first movies called El Mariachi. It was filmed in 1992. It was his breakthrough movie because he did the impossible. This is a famous movie. When you are in film school, or like me, I studied, amongst other things, movie analysis in Rome. This was always coming up as one of the movies that we had to analyze because he made this movie for $7,000. $7,000, that is a little bit above the budget that I have for a TV show here in the Netherlands. That's for a theatrical movie. It's zero, But he made a fantastic movie, and actually a lot of the visual things that he came up with, the way he told the story, became a template for many huge but big budget movies that followed afterwards. There is a DVD, probably also a Blu-ray available, where he gives a director's commentary, and he tells you what he does in El Mariachi. And it is film school. You should buy the DVD or the Blu-ray just for that director's commentary, because it is a crash course in filmmaking from one of the best. And he was very young when he filmed that movie. Now he's an accomplished director, and in the meantime, he directed From Dusk Till Dawn. That's also a cult classic. He was at the helm of Alita Battle Angel. Wasn't the box office success that we all hoped it would be, but it's still a pretty darn good movie. And then he did some other work. But I'm so glad that he was at the helm of this first chapter of the Book of Boba Fett, because I think he did a great job. And I hope that one day we will get to see maybe a release on Blu-ray or some extras on Disney Plus because this episode needs a director's commentary, and especially if you have someone like Robert Rodriguez, I think he could give us so much insight in how they created this new series. It had to be different from The Mandalorian. At the same time, it had to appease the fans. There's a lot of fan service, but it's always done to serve the overall story. It's never on the nose, just like, oh, this is just a collection of, fan-pleasing best-of moments. No, they went really way, way, way farther and deeper than that. And I think over time, we will start to appreciate this series more and more. I tell you, once you go back, this, of course, it's a hard episode to pull off. It's just episode number 1. You have to tell in a short time and still in a compelling way what happened between the Return of the Jedi and this reappearance of Boba Fett. And you have to do it in a way that's compatible with what we saw in The Mandalorian. And at the same time, it has to be Star Wars. It can't just be a sequel for sequel's sake, just to make some money. No, it has to be its own story. It has to have a mythological side to it. All good Star Wars stories are basically modern mythology. And so they clearly have to tap into existing mythology, take those themes and transpose them to the world of Star Wars and use the Star Wars language to touch upon these deeper mythological themes that we are familiar with by reading Greek mythology and, in this case, also biblical stories. It's classic Star Wars. And I think what must be the hardest thing to do is you're just setting up the story. You're just putting the pieces into place. The real story will still have to start. Speaking of which, the next episode, I'm going to do another live watch party. This time, I'm going to do it the moment the new episode drops. So that's going to be 9 a.m. Amsterdam time. That's 3 a.m. Eastern time. And it's midnight Pacific time. So if you're still up, if you've watched this video before the new episode launches, then join me for that live watching party. So what I do is I start a countdown, and then I press the video, so you can press it at the same time, and I give live commentary while I'm watching it. And you won't be able to see the movie. You can see that on your own TV, but you can watch the YouTube video, the commentary on, for instance, a phone or an iPad. And then once we've seen the movie together, I continue to talk a little bit with the people that are awake, and we do some, like, a first rough analysis. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. The second thing I'm going to do is spoiler-free first reaction, which I'm going to post on YouTube. And then the third video is like this one. It's going to be a deep dive into the themes, the overall structure. This is, as you've discovered, not a, look at all the 150 Easter eggs. There are other YouTubers that do a terrific job doing that, but that's not my forte. What I want to do is to show you what this story is based upon and how these big themes from Star Wars are actually inspired by the big stories from the past. And I hope that by discovering what is lying under the surface of this story, you will appreciate the Book of Boba Fett and the rest of Star Wars even more. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Did I miss important elements of the story? I'm sure that you've discovered plenty that I glossed over. Here's your chance to share it with the community. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps the algorithm to find other Star Wars fans that might enjoy this and join us as well, join the conversation. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/Father Roderick. All right. Thanks for watching this. This was longer than I thought it would be. I thought I can do this in 10 minutes, but it's Star Wars. I cannot stop talking about this stuff. But thank you for joining me. See you later. Enjoy the next episode, and may the Force be with you.